Today we're looking at the Code Vein gameplay and determining what makes it a Souls-like. More than try to compare these two games, Code Vein and Dark Souls, to see which one is best, we're gonna compare their gameplay elements and find out where they're similar and where they're distinct. My name's Gloku and this is Code Vein vs Dark Souls. Alright, let's start with the basic combat. This is the most obvious comparison as they are very similar. The weight of the weapons, the pace, the dodge roll, the enemy animations, everything about this combat system is incredibly similar to Dark Souls. There seems to be a light and heavy attack buttons judging from the different attacks we see the character performing. There are combos which are different for each weapon. So far, very similar. Now, we haven't seen any shields, we haven't seen any types of magic either, which I don't think would fit too well with the vampire thing they're going for, so I think it's realistic to expect magic not to be in the final game. There are firearms, however, we can see the female character carrying a rifle, but we don't know if the main character will be able to carry those as well. But as far as melee weapons go, we see a one-handed sword, we see a bunch of two-handed weapons, and combat just seems very similar. We're just not sure if there are other abilities like parries, backstabs, or lunges and stuff like that. But at that point, we're getting into a little more in depth with the combat. So let's talk about some of the more advanced abilities. Dark Souls 3 introduced weapon arts, which was a unique move for each new weapon. Code Vein has special abilities called gifts. We haven't seen any gifts in action yet. I mean, we have some glimpses from the trailer, but they might share some similarities with the weapon arts. However, in Code Vein, these gifts might be a lot flashier than the Dark Souls weapon arts. I think we see some of them in the trailer, as I mentioned, with the main character impaling an enemy with a glove, and the female character growing a spear out of her butt. And since this is an anime game, I think it's natural to expect some over-the-top attacks. So while basic combat looks very similar, advanced combat and advanced abilities may share some similarities, but it feels kinda different. Next, let's talk about gear. In Dark Souls, you can equip different weapons, armor, trinkets, rings. The same might be the case for Code Vein. So far, we know you can equip different weapons and also armor. No word on trinkets, rings, or anything of the sort. The armor is also very important to the story and the setting of both of these games, but while the armor in Dark Souls can come from the most distinct backgrounds, maybe it was worn by an old group of knights, or wizards, or straight up monsters, in Code Vein, they all seem kinda similar. That is because in order for your character to consume blood in combat, he needs to wear this armor called a blood veil. So everything that you wear throughout Code Vein will be of blood veil, but there are different blood veils to find and equip, and they have different abilities. But since its functionality is basically suck enemies' blood, it means the background of the blood veils is from vampires. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll all be the same though. Throughout your journey, you'll find several companions, each one with a different background as a vampire. So while your gear may all come from vampires, they all may have different backgrounds. So in the end, kinda similar to Dark Souls. Maybe not as big of a variety as we're used to, but exploring different backgrounds for vampires and different vampire families is still kind of interesting to me. Next, let's talk about story. The methods for storytelling as well as the themes the story covers seem to be very different. Dark Souls relies on the community of players putting together various pieces of a puzzle to tell a coherent story that's usually buried under item descriptions, environmental clues, and the occasional cutscene. The story of Dark Souls is usually very focused on the world itself, and while the player character may have some importance, he's usually a part of something much bigger, and it's often the case where you don't play the role of the hero, but simply the role you had to play because you're a part of a bigger inevitable circle. In Code Vein, despite there being an interesting world to explore, the story will be much more character focused. Dark Souls obviously has interesting characters, but in Code Vein they'll actually be the stars of the show. You'll be traveling with a buddy at all times, creating the chance for occasional dialogue between characters, having them react to events happening right in front of you. While in Dark Souls the reaction is fully up to the player since your character is mute. So not only do I think we'll see a very different type of story, we'll also see a very different type of storytelling. Next, let's talk about the world. Now, what do you call the world of Dark Souls? It's not really an open world, as it's fairly close, but it's fully interconnected and you can go anywhere on foot. Also, it's not very linear, so it's not fair to call it a linear world. How about we call it an interconnected closed world? The structure of Code Vein will be very similar. You'll play in this area, this closed world called Vein, which is also an interconnected closed world with shortcuts for you to open and checkpoints as well. Now, as far as checkpoints go, we don't know if they'll behave similarly to Dark Souls bonfires, but the world structure sure sounds very, very similar. Next, let's talk about the feel, which is perhaps a hard subject to tackle, since it's very subjective, but in Dark Souls, I always got this feeling of isolation, of facing every new area and every new challenge by myself, and that added some pressure. There was an underlying layer of fear that I would die and lose my souls, fear that I was getting lost, fear that I missed a shortcut or a checkpoint. So yeah, I'd say the feeling of isolation is usually present throughout the entire playthrough, at least the first one. That might not be the case with Code Vein. One of the core features of the game is an AI buddy. So far there's no word on multiplayer, so we'll all just assume that the buddy can only be AI controlled. This AI buddy will travel with you the whole time, and there will be many buddies with different backgrounds and abilities. Now, in a Famitsu interview, it was hinted at that you would have some control over the buddy. Meaning maybe you can tell your buddy to not mess around or just have him be inactive and play by yourself if you want to, but the game is built with the buddy system in mind, and this being one of the main systems in the game, I doubt it will be an optional thing all the time. The developer will be using the buddy to tell the story, to motivate the player to try harder against different bosses, to create an emotional connection with these characters. So with those words in mind, I think Code Vein will feel very different from the lonely, cold, and isolated Dark Souls. Different! And finally, let's talk about difficulty. A lot of people like the Souls games because of their difficulty. They come to Souls for the challenge, because it's satisfying once you finally overcome a boss, and if you're in trouble, you can always summon another player to help you out. In Code Vein, buddies will influence difficulty. If everything goes according to the developer's plan, the buddies will make dying a little less frustrating because you'll feel a connection to that character, and you will want to defeat that boss for their sake, not just because of the challenge it presents, but because you feel connected to this buddy of yours. Now, that's all well and good theoretically. Pulling it off in the final game is another challenge entirely, but a quote from Famitsu interview has left me intrigued. If the player is felled, your buddies will come running in to help. And also, I think there will be many scenes where the player will get rescued by them, and on the contrary, I also think it will be necessary for the player to rescue the buddy. So from these two separate quotes, I conclude two things. One, you don't necessarily die right away like you do in Dark Souls. There could be a down state where the buddy runs to you trying to resurrect. This being a vampire, I think such a mechanic actually kind of makes sense. And two, if I have to spend the whole game rescuing my buddy, what I'll feel towards him is probably not exactly what the developers intended. So with all of this in mind, I think it's fair to say that they're tackling difficulty in a different way. One of the great flaws in the Souls games, in my opinion, is how the boss AI is easily deceived when you have two players fighting it. One player tanks, the other player unloads until the boss swaps targets. The buddy system is in from the start. I'm expecting Code Vein to not have this problem. So while in Souls you may have a hard time against the boss and make it easier by summoning a friend, that doesn't seem to be an option in Code Vein. So I'm expecting the difficulty level to be more or less the same, but you probably won't have the option to make it easier if you want to. Different! So to summarize, what makes Code Vein Souls-like is the combat, the world structure, and the gear. Also, it's an RPG, but we don't know how the leveling system works yet, so decided not to touch that beast yet. And what makes Code Vein unique is the way that it's tackling storytelling, and the buddy system. And also, I think the difficulty related to the buddy system, I think it could have some interesting hooks there. If you have any thoughts of your own regarding Code Vein, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Anything that I discussed today, any of the topics, feel free to do it. Let's open up this conversation. If you'd like to learn more about the Code Vein story, you can click this video right here. If you're in the mood for something else, you can click this video right here. But as always, thank you very much for watching. My name's Globku, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!